The chandeliers dripped silver light across the Grand Hotel ballroom, scattering prisms across champagne glasses and sequined gowns. The air smelled of roses and candle wax, sweet but heavy, as if the entire room had been drenched in excess. Aria Vale sat at a table pressed against the far wall, her back straight and her smile carefully drawn. She lifted her glass with steady hands that betrayed the faintest tremor. The laughter of the guests felt sharper here, each murmur angled like glass against her skin. She had dressed well enough for the night. Her navy gown fitted close to her figure, her heels taller than she preferred, but none hid the truth. She was alone. The bride, her closest friend, shone at the center of the room, fingers entwined with the groom, smile wide beneath a thunder of camera flashes. Around them swirled the city's most polished names, men whose fortunes dictated markets, and women whose dresses dictated envy. Aria knew this world through headlines and quarterly reports. She dissected it on paper, but rarely breathed within its walls. Tonight her solitude stood out, magnified by whispers that did not even pretend subtlety. A woman leaned across from the next table, with a smile that cut, and asked, "Are you?" Aria answered with a nod, curt, and drained her glass to drown the sting. She did not bother to hide her sigh when the woman turned away with that satisfied gleam that whispered, "She came without anyone." How telling. 8 o'clock. Too early to leave without insult, too late to slip unseen into the corridors. Aria thought of standing, of fleeing to the cloakroom, when a new shadow darkened her table. The chair beside her shifted back with decisive grace, and a tall figure lowered himself into it, as if it had always been his. He wore a perfectly black cut, the sheen of a silver tie catching every shard of light. His face was carved in sharp lines, cheekbones that could have been sculpted in frost, eyes of storm gray locked on a table across the room, rather than on her. His presence was not merely noticed but inhaled by every guest within sight. Whispers coiled instantly. Aria's pulse stuttered when he leaned, just enough that his voice reached her ear alone. "Pretend you are with me." She blinked at him, stunned into stillness. Her lips parted, then closed again. She turned her head slightly, searching his features for mockery, but found only that fixed focus aimed elsewhere. Her voice came as a whisper scraped raw. "Excuse me." His jaw did not shift. His eyes stayed trained on a cluster of figures across the hall. "They are watching. If you do not mind, let us both play a part. You will avoid their gossip, I will avoid their trap." Aria let out a faint laugh, half disbelief, half defiance. "So you want me to be your companion for a night? For a stranger?" At that, he finally turned. The gray of his eyes was as cold as it was magnetic, sharp yet glinting as though beneath the ice something fierce stirred. His lips curved just enough to hint at a secret. "Just pretend. Trust me. It will be easier for us both." The scent of sandalwood rose faintly from his collar, steady and grounding against the room's chaos. She bit her lip, weighing, then exhaled. He was right. Already she felt eyes shifting from ridicule to curiosity. A date, not abandoned. A companion, not pitied. She raised her chin with a half-smile that mocked herself as much as him. "Very well, but how far are you taking this play?" His answer was a lift of his brow and a curve at his mouth that promised more than it revealed. "Leave that to me." His arm stretched behind her chair, a gesture casual in appearance but intimate enough to draw gasps muffled behind delicate hands. Aria stiffened, alarm whispering within. "Danger," it said. "This man is too skilled at performance." She kept her smile steady. "What is your name?" "Peter Blackwood." The name struck her like a dropped glass. The youngest magnate in the financial world. A man the press painted as ruthless, a wolf in tailored suits. She had written his name more times than she cared to count, tied to mergers that left rivals bleeding. Acquisitions that devoured entire firms. Good heavens, she thought, what am I doing pretending to be Peter Blackwood's partner? Before she could retreat, he was filling her glass again, every gesture smooth, every courtesy flawless. "Relax, Aria Vale," he said softly, the way one might soothe a skittish bird. Her heart tripped at the sound of her full name in his mouth. "You know me. I remember remarkable faces." His gaze did not flinch from hers, so piercing she had to glance aside. She reminded herself to breathe. She reminded herself this was nothing but theater. But already the audience was engaged. A man nearby leaned to whisper to his wife, who smirked and lifted her brows. Someone else approached, and Peter introduced her with the ease of a longtime companion, voice firm yet laced with amusement. Arya followed his lead, her smiles brittle at first, then softening when laughter rose around them. A lady declared them a striking pair, eyes twinkling with suggestion. Arya nearly laughed aloud. Me, a journalist living on instant coffee paired with this empire builder. And yet, beneath the eyes that burned on them, the role no longer felt unbearable. Whenever her mask threatened to slip, he bent close with a quiet jest, or redirected the conversation with precision. She whispered once, "You are quite the actor." His reply was a whisper of steel against velvet. "Who said I was acting?" The words caught at her breath, left warmth in her cheeks she could not disguise. She forced herself to remember, tomorrow morning, this would be over. She would be surrounded by files, deadlines, and cold numbers at her desk. This glittering room would shrink back to a headline. But tonight, something had begun in this strange bargain struck with a stranger's whisper. The evening stretched like a scene too carefully staged. Laughter layered over music, crystal chimed, and chandeliers swayed faintly in the currents of voices. Arya moved as if within a dream, her arm looped in his when they crossed the hall, her lips shaping words that felt foreign when paired with his presence. Guests asked questions with smiles sharpened by curiosity. Who is she? Where did she come from? Peter fielded each inquiry with calm authority, his hand steady at her back, his gaze cutting down speculation before it could turn ugly. Arya played along. She lifted her chin at compliments, tilted her head at teases, and laughed at jokes even when her heart stumbled in the rhythm. With every moment, the whispers in the room shifted. No longer was she the odd figure sitting alone. Now she was the mystery, the woman who held a man's arm no one else could touch. The performance escalated with a subtle but deliberate rhythm. At the dessert table, he leaned close, his voice brushing her ear like silk. "Smile, Arya. You are doing better now." She bit back a retort, forced the curve of her lips and found the guests nodding approval as if she had always belonged here. Still, her mind never stopped cataloging. She watched who approached him, whose faces brightened at his name, whose eyes hardened. She heard murmurs at the edge of the crowd, piecing together fragments like a puzzle she could one day assemble in her newsroom. Her world and his were colliding in ways she had never imagined. The fireworks outside lit the sky in white and gold. Laughter rose, toasts clinked, the hall throbbed with celebration. Arya thought this was the moment it would end, the curtain closing with the night. Tomorrow she would slip back to anonymity, and he to his glass tower. But as she lifted her face to the sparks exploding against the dark, she felt the weight of his gaze not on the sky, but on her profile. It should have been nothing. It should have been pretend. But the instant his whisper reached her, "Just pretend you are with me," Arya Vale understood that a story had been set in motion, one that would not stop at dawn. And beneath the roar of fireworks, in the hush between heartbeats, she knew it with bone-deep certainty. The first line had been written, and neither of them could erase it. The ballroom hummed with the steady drone of music and laughter, yet at their table a curious stillness seemed to take hold. Arya felt it like a pause in the air, as though the crowd had agreed to watch her next move without saying so aloud. Her hand hovered over her glass, her pulse uneven. She had agreed to the stranger's request, though she told herself it was only to protect her pride, only to mute the whispers that had stung sharper than wine. Yet as she sat with Peter Blackwood at her side, she wondered what price such a bargain might demand. "Why me?" she whispered, lowering her voice so the question would vanish in the tide of music. He did not look at her. His eyes remained on a cluster of figures across the hall, men and women whose gazes had been prying into every corner of the room. "Because they are preparing to ensnare me," he said quietly, "and because they are dissecting you. If you do not mind, we can spare each other." He spoke with the calm certainty of one who made decisions worth millions with no more hesitation. The silver tie at his throat shimmered as he shifted, his profile sharp beneath the chandelier glow. The air around him carried a tension that was not nerves but something colder, something that drew eyes even as it warned them to keep their distance. Arya studied him for a long breath, the line of his jaw, the stillness in his hands. He was not a man begging for favor, nor one offering apology. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, and yet he had asked in his own way for her partnership. She almost laughed aloud at the absurdity. What am I now, an actress in a charade for society's amusement? He turned at last, those steel-gray eyes cutting into hers, glinting faintly as if some private amusement flickered in their depths. "Just pretend," he said again, and there was something in the way his voice curved around the words that made her breath falter. The scent of sandalwood brushed her senses once more. She exhaled, lips tugging into a smile that was half defiance, half surrender. "Very well," she murmured, "but how far are you planning to take this act?" One brow arched, the corner of his mouth lifting with a suggestion of promise. "Leave that to me." His arm shifted over the back of her chair, light but unmistakable. A gesture so practiced, so perfectly measured, that the guests at the next table glanced and then whispered, their expressions shifting from curiosity to envy. Arya felt her spine stiffen, the alarms of instinct ringing inside. "Danger," whispered her mind. "This man plays too well." "What is your name?" she asked finally, her voice thin with caution. "Peter Blackwood." The name was a hammer blow. Arya had written it countless times across articles that dissected the empire he had built. He was a man the business world spoke of with admiration laced with fear, a young magnate whose deals left little room for mercy. To sit beside him now, to be draped in his casual intimacy, was to step onto a stage more perilous than she had realized. Her breath caught, but she forced her expression smooth. Before she could protest, before she could retreat, he was already refilling her glass with effortless civility. "Relax, Arya Vale," he said, his voice gentle yet commanding. Her heart started at the sound of her name from his lips. "You know me." He shrugged, not a trace of arrogance, merely fact. "I remember remarkable faces. Their gazes locked for a heartbeat too long." The strength of his stare pushed her to glance away, but not before heat had risen unbidden to her cheeks. She told herself it was an annoyance, nothing more. She told herself she would laugh at this tomorrow. The performance grew by the moment. A guest approached, wineglass in hand, curiosity etched across his face. Peter rose slightly, his voice smooth, and introduced her as if she had long been at his side. His hand rested lightly against her back, his tone steady, and the guest smiled with satisfaction before departing. Arya forced herself to nod, to smile, to play the role. Another guest praised them as a lovely couple. Arya nearly choked on her laughter. Me, a reporter chasing scandals with ink-stained fingers, and this man, this empire of stone and glass. The absurdity clung to her tongue, yet beneath the weight of watching eyes, the part did not feel unbearable. Not when his hand brushed hers as though by accident, not when his words slid between them like a script only the two of them could read. Each time she faltered, each time her mask threatened to slip, he steadied her with a quiet joke or redirected the conversation, with the skill of a conductor guiding a symphony. She whispered once, "You are quite the actor." "Who said I was acting?" he replied, his words plain yet burning. She looked away, pulse racing, heart stammering between disbelief and something far more dangerous. She swallowed the warmth rising in her chest and reminded herself again and again, it is only a pretense. The hours drew them deeper into the play. They crossed the ballroom together, her arm looped in his gaze sweeping the room like a shield against intrusion. She found herself laughing at moments she would normally scorn, found herself speaking with ease she rarely showed outside the newsroom. His presence was a strange mixture of anchor and storm. The desserts arrived, delicate and gleaming under silver trays. He leaned close, his words brushing against her ear with the heat of command. "Smile, Arya, the eyes are watching." She forced the corners of her lips upward, felt the crowd shift with approving nods. His mouth curved, a reward, a silent acknowledgement that she had played her part well. And yet all the while her mind worked in its own rhythm. She watched the approach of investors, the laughter of politicians, the clinking of glasses in corners where power was brokered behind masks of cheer. She caught fragments of whispered deals, recognized names tied to rumors her editor had muttered about in frustration. This was more than theater. This was a door opening into a world she had only traced from the outside. The chandelier lights dimmed at last, signaling the fireworks outside. The crowd spilled into the terrace, their voices raised in delight. The sky cracked open with bursts of white and gold. Arya tilted her face upward, the glow painting her skin. For a heartbeat, she forgot the role, forgot the man beside her, forgot the whispers that had driven her into his orbit. She let herself watch the sparks scatter against the darkness, wild and fleeting. But when she glanced sideways, she found his eyes not on the sky, but on her. He watched the reflection of fire against her profile, and in that gaze there was no cold steel, no ruthless calculation. Only a stillness so deep it unsettled her more than all his commanding words. It should end here, she told herself. Tomorrow she would return to her desk, to numbers and reports, and this man would return to his empire. But she knew already the truth, and she dared not speak. The whisper that began this night had written a first line neither of them could erase. The bargain struck in glances, sealed with the weight of every watching eye, was no longer a simple act. It was the beginning of something dangerous, something alive. And Arya Vale understood with a certainty that chilled and thrilled her alike that she had stepped onto a path from which she could not easily turn back. The night after their first meeting, Arya stood before her mirror with the reluctant patience of a soldier preparing for a campaign. Her gown shimmered in shades of deep wine, borrowed from her sister's closet, and her hands tightened around the small clutch that held nothing but a lipstick and her press badge tucked discreetly in a side pocket. She had agreed to continue this charade, though she had not said the words aloud. The invitation had arrived that afternoon with his name embossed at the bottom. A charity gala, formal attire, attendance required. She had laughed at its audacity and then, against her better judgment, dressed anyway. When the black car drew up outside her apartment, its polished surface reflecting the streetlights, she almost turned back. The driver stepped out with courteous efficiency and opened the door. Inside sat Peter Blackwood, impeccable in black, silver at his tie, his presence radiating command even in silence. For a moment, she hovered on the curb, a journalist about to step into the den of her own headline. Then she slid inside. The ride was quiet but not uncomfortable. She felt his gaze flick once toward her, measuring the gown, the effort she had chosen. When the car rolled to a stop before the glittering steps of the art museum, her heart thudded with dread. The red carpet stretched like a trial, lined with photographers and guests who thrived on scrutiny. "You are certain about this," she muttered, clutching the edge of her clutch. "These heels are treacherous. If I fall, I may never recover from the humiliation. If you fall, I will carry you inside." He replied, his voice calm, as if the outcome were already decided. His words should have been ridiculous, yet they tangled her composure. She stepped out, her legs stiff against the flashing cameras. For an instant, her heel caught on the edge of the carpet, and her body pitched forward. His hand caught her arm with precise swiftness, steadying her without the slightest strain. The photographers gasped, flashes erupting brighter. She was certain every lens had captured the image of his hand at her elbow, his face turned toward her with what must look like concern. "Breathe," he murmured low, "only for her. Smile as if we practiced this." She forced her lips into a curve and lifted her head. The whispers in the crowd softened to admiration. By the time they reached the museum doors, the stumble had transformed into a story of gallantry. Inside, the hall glowed with gold light, and music swelled against high ceilings. Guests turned immediately, eyes widening at the sight of Peter with a companion. Their murmurs circled like moths to flame. She felt their stares cling to the shape of her gown, the touch of his hand at her back, the way he leaned close to whisper something that made her laugh, though she hardly heard the words. Arya played the part with more conviction than she expected. When a woman complimented her necklace, she thanked her sweetly and redirected the attention back to Peter. When an older man pressed for details of their acquaintance, Peter answered smoothly, weaving a vague but convincing story that painted them as a long-standing pair. Arya nodded at the right places, her eyes bright, her smile graceful. And with every performance, her heart reminded her that she was not merely acting, but surviving under scrutiny sharper than any newsroom interrogation. The first true test came not from the crowd, but from her own clumsiness. At the dessert table, overwhelmed by the glittering array of sweets, she reached for a silver spoon and misjudged her grip. The spoon slipped, landing with a sharp clang into her glass of wine. Crimson liquid sloshed, the sound cutting across the nearby conversations. Heads turned. Heat surged up her neck as mortification clawed her chest. Without pause, Peter lifted his own glass and tapped it with deliberate grace. A clear ringing chime filled the air. "Allow me to propose a toast," he declared, his voice carrying effortlessly, "to generosity, to art, to the success of tonight." Guests raised their glasses in eager chorus. Laughter rippled. The moment dissolved into cheer. Arya exhaled, her cheeks burning not with shame, but with astonishment. She leaned close, voice a whisper edged with relief. "You saved me." He looked at her, expression unreadable, though the faintest glimmer touched his eyes. A true partner never lets the other falter. She swallowed hard, her mind racing with questions she could not ask aloud. Was he always so adept at rescuing reputations? Was this the skill that had built an empire? Or had he, for this instant, chosen to protect her and not just himself? The evening unfurled with a new rhythm. They posed for photographs before a wall of orchids, the photographer urging them closer. She stiffened, ready to protest, but Peter had already drawn her against him, his voice brushing her ear. "Pretend we are newlyweds." Her smile froze, then softened as the cameras clicked in rapid fire. Each flash captured not just an image, but an intimacy that felt too convincing. Later, as they drifted through the gallery of paintings, she let herself breathe again. She lingered before a canvas awash in deep blue, the color of twilight seas. He stopped beside her, his voice low. "My mother loved that shade." She said it reminded her of home. It was the first personal note he had given, unprompted. Arya turned, startled, but his eyes remained fixed on the painting. She did not press him, though her chest ached with the weight of the moment. By the time they returned to the car, her feet throbbed from the shoes, and her heart thudded from the performance. She collapsed against the seat with a laugh she had not intended. "You are relentless," she said. "You guide, you cover, you even rescue with toasts. Do you always live like this?" His gaze remained forward, steady on the dark streets unfolding. "To outsiders, I must remain cold. That is the armor. But with you, I need not pretend as much." The words stilled her laughter. She turned her face to the window, hiding the tremor that threatened her lips. She told herself not to believe them, not to let them sink beneath her ribs. Yet they echoed there anyway, filling spaces she had guarded for years. By the time she reached her apartment door, the city had shifted around her. She had played her part on the red carpet, passed her first test beneath chandeliers and orchids, and emerged unbroken. But the cost was clear. The line between act and truth was blurring with every step she took beside him. Inside, she removed her shoes with a sigh and set her clutch on the table. Her press badge slid out, the name Arya Vale gleaming against the lamplight. She stared at it for a long moment, then tucked it away. She was a journalist, trained to chase the truth no matter the cost. Yet, tonight she had been something else entirely. She fell onto the couch, head tilted back, eyes tracing the cracks in her ceiling. The faint scent of sandalwood lingered on her gown where his hand had rested. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself as though in warning, "This is only a pretend." But the silence answered her with a truth she already feared. Pretend or not, she was no longer certain she could keep her heart from believing the act. The gala stretched deep into the evening, its glittering facade hiding the undercurrent of whispered bargains and secret intentions. Arya had spent hours at Peter's side, her smile polished, her laughter precise, each gesture reinforcing the illusion that she belonged to him. The red carpet had been survived, the photographers disarmed, and her stumbles smoothed over with his impeccable timing. Yet, she felt like a tightrope walker balanced above a chasm, every step more dangerous than the last. As music swirled through the museum halls, she excused herself with the grace of a woman seeking another glass of wine. In truth, she wanted space, a moment where she could breathe without his eyes reading her every hesitation. She drifted toward the buffet, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. There, near the curve of the long table, two men stood hunched together, their voices lowered but urgent. Arya had learned long ago how to listen without seeming to listen. She pretended to examine the arrangement of chocolates, her ears tuned to the cadence of their conversation. "Funds are moving too quickly," one murmured, his accent sharp. "Cayman transfers through WYNX Holdings. If it keeps flowing like this, someone will notice." Another voice, deeper, replied, "Only if the signature wavers. As long as Blackwood's name is stamped cleanly, the trail stays invisible." Arya's fingers tightened on the stem of her glass until she feared it might snap. The name, the company, the Cayman Whispers. It was everything her editor had been urging her to pursue, and here it was, spoken like a careless confession beneath chandeliers. She swallowed hard, pressing the details into memory. Her pulse raced with the thrill of a lead, the kind that could crack open the scandal her newsroom had only suspected. But the rush was tempered by dread. If Peter's name was indeed tied to these flows, then the man who had steadied her arm on the red carpet, who had whispered about music and mothers, was entangled in something darker than charm. She steadied her breath, picked up a plate, and slid a small mousse onto it as if this had been her only intention. When she turned back toward the crowd, Peter's gaze was already on her. He stood across the hall in conversation with a cluster of investors, but his eyes followed her every step. Arya forced a bright smile and lifted the plate in silent explanation. Dessert. His expression did not shift, yet something in the set of his jaw told her he had noticed her absence too keenly. When she reached him, he leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that the others could not hear. "Where did you go?" "For more dessert," she replied, lifting the mousse with feigned innocence. He studied her face as if reading a page he suspected was written in cipher. Finally, he inclined his head, dismissing the subject with outward calm. "Do not make me search for you in the crowd. A real partner does not vanish halfway through the night. A fake one does," she answered with a smile that carried more defiance than she intended. The men around them chuckled politely, unaware of the tension beneath their words. Peter allowed the smile at the corner of his mouth to curve just slightly, but his eyes did not soften. The rest of the evening unfolded with rehearsed perfection. They posed for more photographs, shared toasts with dignitaries, and played their roles with a synchronicity that made onlookers nod in approval. Yet beneath the glitter, Arya's thoughts spun. Every laugh she gave, every smile she forced, was shadowed by the whisper she had overheard. Cayman, WYNX, signatures. Words that could topple empires and destroy lives. As the gala drew toward its close, the guests moved into the gallery for a final viewing of the art. Arya lingered by the blue painting that had caught her earlier, its colors deep and endless like the ocean at dusk. Peter joined her, his voice unexpectedly soft. "My mother loved this shade. It reminded her of the sea back home." Arya turned, startled by the intimacy of his tone. He stood with his eyes fixed on the painting, his expression stripped of its usual armor. For a moment, she glimpsed something fragile, something unguarded. She had not expected a confession from a man like him. "I did not think you would ever speak of family," she said quietly. "I did not think I would tell anyone tonight," he replied, his voice low with memory. Her chest tightened. This was not the voice of a ruthless magnate, not the cold figure who stood on magazine covers. This was a man shaped by loss, by shadows she did not yet understand. And yet, behind that confession lay the whisper of Cayman and signatures, a darkness she could not ignore. On the ride home, silence filled the car. Arya sat with her hands folded, the mousse untouched in her lap. She repeated the words she had overheard, the names, the places, committing them to memory like evidence. She stole a glance at Peter, He sat with his eyes on the city flashing by the window, his profile calm, unreadable. She wanted to ask, to demand, to confront. Instead, she bit her tongue. If he was guilty, she needed proof. If he was innocent, she needed to be sure before she destroyed him. Her heart pulled in one direction, her profession in another, and she felt the tightrope beneath her feet tremble. At her apartment, he walked her to the door. For a moment, they stood in the hush of the corridor, the world of chandeliers and whispers left behind. His eyes lingered on her, and his voice dropped. "You did well tonight." Arya managed a nod. "Thank you." His hand brushed hers lightly, a gesture so fleeting it could have been accidental. Then he turned, his steps echoing down the hall, leaving her heart thrumming against her ribs. Inside her apartment, she set the untouched mousse on the counter and sank into a chair. The evening gown shimmered under the dim lamp, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne. She pressed her palms to her eyes and exhaled. "This is not just a game anymore," she whispered to the empty room. On her desk lay her laptop, screen dark. She opened it, the glow spilling across her face, and pulled up the files on the financial scandal her editor had hounded her about. Numbers blurred across the page, including offshore accounts and subsidiaries with names that smelled of secrecy. She typed in the keyword she had memorized, WYNX, Holdings. A flood of data scrolled across the screen. Cayman accounts, unexplained transfers, signatures obscured in scans. Her hand trembled as she clicked through each page. The threads were there, faint but undeniable, and at the center of those threads, his name shimmered like a blade in the dark. Arya closed the laptop with a snap, her breath ragged. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if it could anchor her. The night had begun with a whisper, a pretend partnership meant to silence gossip. Now it had drawn her into a storm far larger than she had imagined. She was not only pretending to be Peter Blackwood's companion. She was standing at the edge of unraveling his empire. Her pulse steadied as resolve settled in her chest. She would not walk away. She would not let fear or attraction cloud her purpose. She was a journalist, and this was the story she had been waiting for. And yet, as she drifted toward restless sleep, she could not banish the image of his eyes softened by memory, the sound of his voice when he spoke of his mother. Somewhere between truth and lie, justice and desire, she was already trapped. Tomorrow, she knew, the game would deepen. And the first clue she had overheard in a gilded hall was only the beginning of the storm. The following evening did not lead Arya into another hall of glittering gowns and polished marble. Instead, the car wound its way toward the heart of the city, where an old theater stood, its facade aged but dignified, its marquee glowing with the announcement of a symphony. Beethoven and Rachmaninoff, the letters declared in proud golden light. Arya blinked in surprise as she stepped from the car. She had expected champagne towers, another gaudy show of wealth. Instead, Peter offered her music. She glanced at him with narrowed eyes. "You brought me here instead of another gala. Why?" His gaze was steady, unreadable. "My pretend companion deserves touches of reality too. Otherwise, the performance will lose its conviction." The words should have been cold, but beneath them she sensed something else. She followed him inside, the hush of velvet seats and the sweep of painted ceilings greeting them. The chandeliers here were softer, their glow golden rather than blinding. They sat side by side, shoulders brushing, the narrow space binding them in unspoken intimacy. As the orchestra began, the notes swelled, sometimes whisper soft, sometimes storm fierce. Arya stole glances at him when she dared. The stern line of his profile seemed softened, his eyes distant, fixed on some horizon only he could see. She had written of him in articles as ruthless, unyielding, driven only by profit. Yet here, his face held the trace of a boy lost in memory. When the cello hummed low, he leaned slightly closer. "When I was a child, my mother played music like this at night. She said that whatever else I became, I must always remember to listen." Arya tilted her head, startled by the intimacy of the confession. "She died when I was 10, he continued quietly, his eyes never leaving the stage. "My father believed silence mattered more than music. To him, strength meant flawlessness, no mistakes allowed." Her breath caught. Flawless? That sounds suffocating. He finally turned, the gray of his eyes catching the dim glow. "It was," he said, "but without that perfection, I would never be where I am." He spoke with conviction, but the edges of his voice frayed with something he could not disguise. Arya wanted to reach for his hand, to offer comfort, but she was not sure he would accept. Instead, she whispered, "Maybe he forgot that sometimes imperfection makes someone unforgettable." A pause lingered between them, filled with violins. His lips curved faintly, almost a smile, and then the music surged again, leaving the words to hover between them like a secret. After the concert, the night carried them to a cafe tucked against the square, a place of wooden tables and the scent of roasted beans. Arya looked around in wonder. "Never thought I would see Peter Blackwood in a simple cafe." "Do not tell anyone," he replied dryly. "My reputation would shatter." She laughed, surprised at his humor. They drank coffee, speaking of travels, of books neither had finished, of the ways music threaded through their memories. Slowly, she realized the man across from her was not entirely armored. Beneath the polished surface, there was warmth, reluctant but real. For a fleeting moment, she forgot her purpose, forgot the files waiting on her laptop. While he stepped outside to answer a call, she slipped her phone from her clutch. She scrolled through the photographs she had captured at the symphony, donation envelopes, sponsor plates engraved with names. Several matched the list she had been chasing, names tied to the mysterious funds whispering through offshore accounts. Her heart raced. This was progress, evidence hidden in plain sight, gained only because she had agreed to this charade. She saved the images quickly, slipping the phone away just as he returned. He studied her face, suspicion flickering in his gaze. "Something wrong?" "No," she said, stirring her coffee with feigned calm. "Only thinking that perhaps I should wear lower heels tomorrow, so you will stop mocking me when I stumble." His lips curved again, that faint, dangerous smile. "Then I will hold your hand tighter so your shoes will not betray you again." The words stole her breath. She laughed too loudly, hiding her fluster. He leaned back, still watching her, the spark in his eyes sharper than the cafe light. That night, when she returned to her apartment, she sat before her laptop with the pen drive of notes and photographs. Names and numbers began to form a pattern. But every time she traced the lines back to the center, she found his name waiting. She closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her lips, still tingling with the memory of his confession about his mother, about music. Her heart and her mind had become rivals. One whispered that this man was dangerous, tied to laundering funds across continents. The other whispered of a boy who had lost his mother young, who carried memories in shades of blue and symphonies. "Just pretend," she whispered to herself. "Do not forget." But the words rang hollow. She knew the act was slipping. She was falling into a story she had not meant to write, one where the lines between truth and pretense blurred until she could no longer tell which was which. The next day, the newsroom was alive with chatter. Reports flew across desks, rumors of investigations grew louder, and her editor barked for sharper leads. Arya buried herself in files, her pulse racing each time the name WYNX appeared. By evening, exhaustion weighed on her. But another invitation arrived, this time to a museum fundraiser. She hesitated only a moment before answering. That night, the grand hall of the museum glowed with dazzling light. Abstract paintings lined the walls, and the air hummed with the chatter of donors and art enthusiasts. Peter guided her inside, his hand steady on her waist. "Do not be nervous," he murmured. "I am not nervous," she whispered back, though her heel caught on the carpet again, forcing him to catch her arm. His frown deepened. "Careful. I will not have my companion turn into a joke within minutes. Instead of mocking me, you could simply say I look beautiful," she retorted, her eyes narrowing. He tilted his head, eyes glinting. "You look beautiful, but your shoes are traitors." She bit her lip, suppressing a smile, and slipped back into the role. Together they wove through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries, fielding glances. When she faltered, he steadied her. When she dropped a spoon into her glass by accident again, he turned it into a toast, laughter spilling across the hall. Then, as they posed before a wall of orchids, the photographer directed him to hold her closer. Peter obeyed without hesitation, pulling her against him, his breath warm against her ear. "Pretend we are happy newlyweds." Her heart stuttered as the cameras flashed. She forced a smile, but it felt too real, too natural. Later, when they walked the gallery, she drifted again toward conversations at the edges. She overheard two men speaking of a subsidiary funneling funds through Europe. She caught the name, memorized it, and returned to his side with another innocent smile. When he asked where she had been, she raised her dessert plate. "For Moose," she said. He studied her eyes, suspicious but silent. By the end of the night, she felt the weight of secrets pressing against her ribs. Each laugh, each touch, each whisper was tangled with threads of evidence. She was no longer certain whether she was acting for the cameras or for herself. On the ride home, he spoke again of his mother, of the blue sea she had loved. His eyes were no longer cold, but softened with memory. Arya turned away quickly, afraid he might see the conflict in her own. At her desk that night, she whispered aloud, "If he is guilty, I will expose him. If he is innocent, I will prove it. But God, do not let me fall any further." The files on her laptop glowed, and the names she had overheard were now marked in bold. The storm was gathering, and she was already caught within it. The newsroom glowed with the pale light of monitors, the hum of voices and printers filling the air. Arya sat at her desk long after the others had left, her laptop screen glaring at her with merciless numbers. She had been chasing fragments for weeks, subsidiaries that did not exist except on paper, transfers that circled the globe, signatures stamped onto documents like ghosts. Now, at 2 in the morning, she had stumbled on the name again. WYNX Holdings. The accounts bled money into shadows, disappearing into offshore silence. She rubbed her eyes, her pulse quickening. The scan of a document flickered on her screen, and at the bottom, sharp and clean, rested his name, Peter Blackwood. The strokes of the signature were bold, decisive, and unhesitant. She zoomed in until the ink became pixels, searching for imperfection. It was his handwriting. She knew it, as surely as she knew the sound of his voice. Her stomach turned. If this were real, he was at the center of the scandal her editor had been thirsting for. If it was forged, then someone had chosen him as a scapegoat, and she was in the middle of a storm bigger than she had ever chased. Arya leaned back, pressing her hands against her face. She wanted to believe the man who had spoken softly about his mother, who had caught her when her heels betrayed her. But she was a journalist, sworn to follow the truth wherever it led. Her conscience screamed at her to write, her heart whispered for patience. The next day, her editor summoned her into his office. Papers were piled high, glasses slipping down his nose, his tone as sharp as steel. "We cannot wait any longer, Vale. You have enough to publish." "It is not verified yet," she argued. "Forged signatures exist. I need confirmation." "You will have 1 week," he snapped, "or I will hand it to Knox." Arya froze. Knox, the rival reporter who lived for blood, who would shred Peter's name in 500 brutal words without a second thought. She clenched her jaw and nodded. 1 week. That night, she was not in the newsroom or her apartment. She was at a birthday celebration for one of Peter's closest friends. It was smaller, less polished, filled with loosened ties and jazz music curling under neon lights. She told herself she was there for her story, for the chance to overhear, for the possibility of a lead. But when she saw him across the room, jacket unbuttoned, tie undone, glass of whiskey in hand, she forgot the script. She sat at the bar, twirling her martini glass, amused at the thought of him dancing. If I wrote tomorrow that the cold CEO of Wall Street could sway to jazz, the markets would faint. "What headline is amusing you?" he asked, appearing behind her, his tone half amused. She turned to meet his eyes, still glimmering even in the dim light. Something like Blackwood drunk on a barstool, stock drops 3%. He arched a brow and sipped his drink. "If that ever happened, my stock would fall by 10. She burst into laughter, unguarded and real, and for the first time, she saw his own smile stretch wider than a polite curve. For a few minutes, they were not a magnate and a journalist, but two people teasing each other under the music. The party thinned as the night deepened. Outside, the air was cool, street lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. He walked her down the steps, slower than usual, the whiskey mellowing his stride.
"Are you drunk?"
she asked, her voice a whisper of challenge. "I can handle it," he replied, though his steps faltered slightly. They stopped at the bottom of the stairs, silence spreading between them like a taut rope. He turned, his eyes no longer cold, but softened by something raw. "You make me forget this is just pretend," he said. Her breath caught. She opened her mouth to deflect, to laugh, but the words stuck. He stepped closer, closing the distance until her back touched the wall. His gaze locked on hers, and before she could speak, his lips brushed hers. The kiss was sudden, brief, but charged with a heat that set her heart racing. Whiskey clung to his breath, sandalwood to his collar, but beneath it all was something she could not name. She froze, then melted, unable to push him away, unwilling to stop him. When he drew back, his lips still close enough for his breath to warm her cheek, she whispered, "Are you insane?" "Maybe," he murmured, a faint smile ghosting across his mouth. Her hand rose to her lips, stunned, torn between laughter and panic. "God, the ice-cold CEO just kissed me." "We are pretending," she reminded him, though her voice wavered. "Yes," he said, but his eyes burned with something that betrayed his words. "But there are moments I do not want to act anymore." She had no reply. Her heart thundered as he guided her to the waiting car. The ride home was cloaked in silence, but her thoughts screamed. She had just uncovered a signature that tied him to laundering. She had just kissed him as if the world around them did not exist. When the car pulled up to her building, he opened his eyes from where he had rested them against the seat. "Good night, Parker," he said softly, his voice low with exhaustion and something unspoken. She stepped out, the city lights reflecting against her face. "Good night, Blackwood," she whispered as the car pulled away. She wanted to add, "And here is hoping I do not dream of trouble," but the trouble was already awake inside her. In her apartment, she tossed her clutch onto the table, pulled off her shoes and fell onto the couch. The laptop on her desk glowed with the report on WYNX Holdings, untouched. She stared at it, then pressed her fingers to her lips, the ghost of his kiss still lingering. The first crack had opened. Sleep came late, restless and full of tangled dreams. When she woke to the pale light of dawn, she knew she stood at the edge of a precipice. Her editor expected an exposé that could ruin him. Her heart carried a memory that might destroy her. She whispered into the quiet apartment, torn between duty and desire. "This is the only complication, only a dangerous complication." But the words carried no weight, and she knew it. The kiss had already rewritten the rules. The office tower of the Wynn Consortium rose like a blade of glass against the sky. Its windows mirrored the city in sharp reflection, swallowing light and returning only the suggestion of strength. Arya had walked into many corporate buildings before, chasing executives for comments, piecing together scraps of truth from corridors of polished stone. But nothing had prepared her for the scope of Peter's world. The atrium yawned wide, ceilings so high they seemed to deny gravity. A sweep of marble where employees moved briskly like figures in a symphony. He walked beside her, his stride steady, his hand occasionally brushing hers as if to remind her that tonight she was his companion, not a reporter with a secret mission. But Arya felt the weight of the flash drive in her purse like a stone, the evidence she had gathered pressing against her conscience with every step. The elevator carried them upward to the 50th floor. Its walls reflected their images, fractured in steel and glass. She caught a glimpse of her own face, calm on the surface, trembling beneath, and his impassive, unreadable, a fortress carved from discipline. When the doors opened, his world unfolded in a single sweep. The office was vast, lined with shelves of leather spines, a desk of walnut large enough to command nations, and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the city sprawled like a conquered map below. Arya stepped forward, her breath caught. "This is not an office, it is an empire." He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth curving faintly. "You would find working here anything but comfortable. The view tempts one into believing he holds the city in his hand." He guided her toward a wall dominated by a world map dotted with pins across continents. Red lines stretched between them, marking paths of ambition. "This is where I plan our next steps. Energy is in Asia, biotech is in Europe, and online education is in South America. I want the company not only to profit, but to leave something of value behind." She listened, stunned by the conviction in his tone. These were not the words of the cold magnate she had portrayed in headlines. They sounded almost noble, almost human. Yet she remembered the signatures, the Cayman whispers, the shadow of fraud. "It sounds like a speech for a prize committee," she teased, her voice lighter than she felt. His gaze turned on her, sharper. "Do you always hide behind sarcasm?" "It is my shield," she admitted softly. For a moment, silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the city below. Guilt tightened around her chest. He was showing her visions, offering trust, and she carried betrayal in her purse. That evening, he took her to dinner at a riverside restaurant. The tables were small, the candles warm, and the river outside was reflecting city lights in ripples of gold. No cameras, no board members, no scrutiny. Just him and her, the weight of unspoken words pressing closer with each passing minute. Arya stared at the menu without seeing it. The word signature burned behind her eyes like a warning light. She wanted to ask him to lay the document on the table and demand an answer. "Did you sign these transfers? Did you stain your name with laundering?" But when she met his eyes, steady and calm, her courage fled. "You are quiet tonight," he remarked, tilting his head. "I am hungry," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "If you are hungry, we will order everything," he replied, in earnest seriousness that made her laugh despite herself. He looked at her then, really looked, and her laughter faded into something more fragile. Later, they walked along the riverbank. The air was cool, the water lapping softly against the stone. He stopped suddenly, his voice low. "Do you ever feel as though you keep pushing only to please everyone else?" She froze, startled. "Are you speaking of yourself or of me?" "Both." The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. He turned toward her, his eyes reflecting the shimmer of lights across the water. "I have never met anyone like you, Arya. You are so sharp and independent, and yet you make others want to protect you." Her heart stumbled. "You should drink less wine," she deflected. "It makes you say things that might be misunderstood." "It is not the wine." The silence that followed was charged, fragile as glass. She bit her lip, torn between laughing and crying. She wanted to believe him, wanted to reach for the warmth she glimpsed. But the document waited, a blade at her conscience. "If I stumble again in these shoes, will you still catch me?" she whispered, trying to hide her turmoil behind humor. "No matter how many times you fall," he murmured, leaning close, "I will always catch you as long as you let me." The words struck her harder than any evidence she had gathered. That night in her apartment, the laptop glowed again. The scan of his signature stared back at her, bold and unyielding. It could be real, it could be forged. Either way, it was her duty to decide. She buried her face in her hands, whispering to the quiet room. "Justice or love, which path do I walk?" Outside, the city lights burned with relentless brilliance. Inside, she sat at the fault line where empire and heart collided, the rope beneath her trembling with every step she dared take. The newsroom smelled of ink and coffee gone stale. Arya sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if the keys might bite. Her editor's words still clanged in her ears. 1 week, Vale. Deliver or Knox will. The ultimatum burned like a brand. She opened the file that contained the leaked scans, and there it was again. Peter's signature, bold as iron, across the bottom of a transfer report. She stared until the letters blurred. She knew the weight of his hand, the decisive line of his pen. She had seen it on documents he signed at dinners, on notes scrawled for waiters, on the gift he had given her with her name etched into a pen. Every line matched. Her reason screamed it was evidence. Her heart cried that it was a trap. Colleagues whispered as she passed through the newsroom corridors. Some claimed she was sitting on a bombshell. Others speculated she had gone soft. She ignored them, but inside, their words festered. That night she sat in her apartment, her phone in her hand, Peter's number glowing on the screen. She typed, "We need to talk about your company." Deleted it. I typed again, "But I have something important to tell you." Deleted. She let out a bitter laugh. I sound like a teenager with a crush, not a reporter ready to drop an empire. Finally, she wrote, "We need to meet privately." His reply came almost instantly. "Tomorrow night, my office." Sleep abandoned her that night. She tossed on her sheets, thoughts colliding in a storm. One moment, she saw his face softened by candlelight, speaking of his mother. The next time she saw the signature, it was etched into fraud. She pressed her face into the pillow, whispering, "God, why do I have to choose between love and truth?" The next evening, the glass tower loomed before her again. She walked through its shining doors with her heart hammering so violently she thought the guards must hear it. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened to the 50th floor, he was already waiting. His face was carved from steel, and his gaze was unreadable. "Peter." She said his name softly, but he flinched as if it were a wound. "Do not say my name like it belongs to you," he answered, his voice low, rough, each word sharp enough to cut. Her breath caught. He knew. "You came close to me for your story, did you not?" His eyes blazed with restrained fury. "I let you into my world, told you about my mother, and introduced you to Emily. And all the while you were digging into my company." Tears burned in her eyes, but she forced herself to speak. "Yes, I came for the story. I found irregularities. Documents with your name. I could not ignore them. So, I am the greedy wolf, the mastermind," he thundered, stepping closer. "Is that what you think?" Her voice cracked. "I do not know. I have evidence with your signature, but I cannot pretend I do not feel something for you too." The silence that followed was suffocating. Only her frantic heartbeat filled it. "So all of it, the hand-holding, the smile, that kiss, it was all part of your plan." "Number," she shook her head violently. "Maybe at the start, but later, I truly felt something. You must believe me." "Believe." His laugh was sharp and cold. "I, who trusted no one, fell into a reporter's trap. Please, listen." "It is over," he said, his voice ragged, final. "I do not want to see you again." The door shut behind him with a sound that splintered her chest. She collapsed into the chair, her hands trembling, her tears spilling unchecked. In one morning, she had lost both her story and her heart. That night, she stood by her window, staring at the city lights. Somewhere out there, he sat in his empire of glass, furious and wounded. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, whispering into the night, "I never meant to hurt you." But the city did not answer. Only the hum of traffic below reminded her that the world moved on while hers had shattered. The next day, Roberts cornered her editor, pressing for the file. If Arya would not publish, he would. She panicked and stormed into the office, her voice steady though her heart quaked. "I will write it. It will come from me." Her editor studied her with sharp suspicion, then nodded. "Good. 1 week, Vale." She left the office with the weight of doom. She had just bought herself time, but also sealed her own fate. She walked home in a daze, the cursor blinking on her empty page like a taunt. She could not write. Each word she tried to form dissolved into tears. Outside her window, the city's neon lights bled across the night sky. Inside, she whispered to herself, "Tomorrow I will tell him. Tomorrow I will choose." But she knew with a sinking certainty that tomorrow might already be too late. The week that followed felt like walking a blade's edge. Arya woke each morning with the city's noise drifting through her window, and the heavy reminder that her deadline loomed closer. Her editor expected her article, Robert circled like a vulture, and Peter's absence hollowed out every step she took. Her apartment had become a battlefield. On one side lay the files, the scans of transfers, the ledger pages dotted with numbers that did not add up. On the other side lay her memories, the brush of his hand on hers, his voice confessing fragments of his childhood, the fire in his eyes when he kissed her. She had notebooks scattered across her desk, lines of half-written sentences torn apart by doubt. One page carried a headline she had scribbled at 3 in the morning, "The Blackwood Scandal." She had ripped it in half before dawn. At the newsroom, she kept her mask intact. She smiled at colleagues, answered questions with clipped assurance, and sat at her desk typing words that dissolved into silence. Roberts passed by once, his smirk dripping venom. "Better hurry, Vale, I would hate to write your story for you." That night, she found herself walking along the riverbank alone. the same path she had once taken beside him. The city lights shimmered across the water, cruel in their beauty. She wanted to hate him, wanted to anchor herself in anger, but anger gave way to longing, and longing gave way to fear. Her phone buzzed in her hand, an anonymous message. One line only, look closer at Hale. Attached was a file. Her breath caught as she opened it. Scanned contract and transfer slip were all signed not by Peter, but by Richard Hale, his vice president, the man she had seen beside him at board meetings. The signatures matched perfectly. Her heart slammed against her ribs. If these documents were authentic, then Peter was innocent. But authenticity was a fragile thread. Anonymous sources could mislead. Forgeries could deceive. She needed proof strong enough to silence even Roberts. She stayed awake until dawn, combing through the file. The pattern emerged clearly with each page. The trail that had seemed to end at Peter curved, twisting sharply toward Hale. At noon, she left the newsroom early, her nerves pulled taut. She could not tell her editor yet. She needed certainty. Instead, she went to the Blackwood estate. She told herself she was there for information, but when Emily opened the door with her warm smile, she felt her composure falter. Emily welcomed her inside, unaware of the storm brewing. Over tea, Emily shared stories of her brother's relentless drive and the nights he had fallen asleep at his desk. Arya listened with her chest aching. When Emily excused herself to fetch dessert, Arya wandered to the study. Papers lay neatly stacked on the desk, as well as contracts, letters, and drafts of plans for expansion. She scanned them quickly, guilt gnawing at her ribs. One sheet caught her attention. It was a proposal signed by Peter, his handwriting unmistakable. She traced the letters with her eyes, comparing them to the forged scans in her possession. Something was off. The loops were different, and the pressure was uneven. Her suspicion sharpened. The signatures in the scans had been too perfect, too mechanical. This one carried the flaws of a real hand. She copied the details into her notebook and slipped back into her chair before Emily returned. She accepted a plate of cake with a smile that hid her racing heart. That night, as she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, not a file, but a warning. Stop digging or you will regret it. Fear prickled along her skin, but it only steeled her resolve. If someone wanted her silent, it meant she was closer to the truth than ever. The next day, she followed a trail to a quiet cafe downtown where she had arranged to meet a source. The man slid into the booth across from her, his hat low over his face. He whispered quickly, nervously, "Hale is moving funds." He used Blackwood's name to shield himself. The board suspects, but no one dares to speak. Before she could press further, the man stood and vanished into the crowd, leaving her with only a scrap of paper scribbled with account numbers. Her hands trembled as she folded it away. Each piece fits tighter into the puzzle. But the danger circled closer too. As she left the cafe, she felt footsteps behind her. Two men, broad-shouldered, moving too deliberately. She turned down a narrow street, her pace quickening. A car engine roared. Tires screeched as a black sedan cut across her path. Her pulse surged with terror. The men stepped closer, their faces hard. One spoke with a sneer. "Mr. Hale says your curiosity ends tonight." Her breath hitched. She staggered back, her mind screaming. And then, as if conjured by her fear, headlights blazed. A familiar car swerved to a halt, its door flying open. Peter stepped out. His face was a storm, his eyes burning with fury. "Touch her," he said, his voice low and lethal. The weight of it alone made the men hesitate. They cursed and retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Arya collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. He approached slowly, his face cold. "How did you know I was here?" she whispered. "I do not abandon those who once stood beside me," he answered, his voice clipped, stripped of warmth. Tears filled her eyes. "Peter, please. I have proof you are innocent. Hale is the one." "Do not," he cut her off, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Do not call me like there is still something between us." She flinched as though struck. "You do not believe me." He let out a bitter laugh. "You hid, you betrayed, you let the world tear me apart, and now you expect me to believe?" Her throat closed, her words choked by despair. She wanted to pull the documents from her bag, to show him the truth, to beg him to see, but his eyes were already walls, unreachable. He turned away, his coat billowing in the night. His tall figure receded into the dark, leaving her trembling, tears streaking down her face. She whispered into the silence, "I will prove it, Peter. Even if you never forgive me, I will prove you are innocent." Back in her apartment, she opened her laptop, her hands shaking. She began to type, each keystroke a vow. She would finish the article, not to destroy him, but to clear his name, to uncover the truth, even if it shattered her own heart. The shadows of proof surrounded her now, dangerous and unrelenting. But in those shadows lay the only path forward. The article went live on a Monday morning, its title quiet yet sharp as steel. Who really stands behind the Blackwood scandal? The truth about forged signatures. Arya had written it with trembling hands, pouring into it every fragment of evidence she had pieced together. She traced the flow of funds through shadowed subsidiaries, laid bare the trail toward Richard Hale, and highlighted the mechanical perfection of the forged signatures. She wrote not like a journalist hungering for blood, but like a woman desperate to carve light into a storm. The city erupted. By noon, her phone vibrated endlessly with calls and messages. Other outlets picked up her piece, investors whispered of betrayal, and the stock that had been plummeting began to steady. For the first time since the scandal broke, Peter's name was no longer a curse in headlines. But Arya felt no triumph. She sat at her desk, her heart heavy, knowing that though the world might see him differently now, he still looked at her with eyes like frost. That afternoon, the danger struck. As she left the newsroom, the street outside seemed too quiet. Then the black car swerved across her path. She barely had time to gasp before hands seized her, and a cloth pressed hard against her face. The sharp sting of chemicals filled her lungs, and the world spun into darkness. When she opened her eyes again, the air was thick with dust and oil. She was tied to a chair in the middle of an abandoned warehouse. The flicker of a single bulb painted shadows across rusted beams. And there before her sat Richard Hale, his smile venomous. "Miss Vale," he said softly, as though addressing a child, "you have caused me trouble. I warned you once. You should have stopped digging." Her pulse thundered, but she forced her voice steady.
"Are you truly so afraid of the truth?"
"The truth," he sneered, "exists only so long as its bearer remains alive." He lifted a blade, letting its glint catch the dim light. "You will delete your files, retract your claims, and then you will disappear." Her throat tightened, but her gaze did not waver. "I would rather die than let you soil the Blackwood name any longer." His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "I despise stubborn women." At that moment, the warehouse doors thundered open. The screech of tires outside, the pounding of boots on concrete, shouts filled the air as police stormed inside. But Peter was the first through the door. His presence cut through the chaos like a blade. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black, his gray eyes burned with fury. Richard jolted, jerking the knife to Arya's throat. "Stay back, Blackwood, or she dies here." For one heart-stopping instant, time froze. Peter's chest heaved, his gaze locked on the blade against her skin. Every image of her, her laughter, her fire, her stubbornness, flashed in his mind like lightning. His voice broke through the silence, hoarse, searing. "Let her go, Hale. Do not drag yourself deeper." Richard's sneer wavered as the officers closed in. In that split hesitation, Peter lunged. He ripped Arya free, shoving her clear just as the blade nicked her arm. A gunshot cracked. Shouts rang. Richard fell under the weight of officers, restrained, snarling. Arya collapsed against Peter's chest, her blood seeping through the torn fabric of her sleeve. His hands trembled as they cradled her, the icy mask of his face shattered into raw terror. "Arya, do not close your eyes. Can you hear me?" She forced her lids open, her lips pale. "Peter, do you believe me now?" He gripped her hand, his voice breaking. "Do not speak. I believe you. Please, do not leave me." The ambulance's siren wailed. They lifted her onto the stretcher. He climbed in beside her, never letting go of her hand. His head bowed low as he whispered, desperate as prayer, "God,
Take everything I have, my company, my name, my empire. Just let her live." Hours later, he sat outside the emergency room, his suit stained with her blood, his eyes hollow with sleeplessness. The police approached with updates. Richard Hale was in custody, and his scheme was exposed. But Peter barely listened. His world narrowed to the door that kept him from her. "Save her," he whispered again and again. "I fear nothing except losing her." That night, for the first time, the man who had built an empire realized that all of it meant nothing without her. Inside the hospital room, machines beeped steadily, fragile promises of life. Arya lay pale beneath the white sheets, her lashes still. Peter sat beside her, his head bowed against her hand. "I was a fool," he whispered, his voice breaking. "A fool not to believe you. Please wake. I swear I will never let you go again." And as dawn broke, her lashes fluttered. Her eyes opened slowly, weary but alive. Her lips parted, whispering his name, Peter. His breath caught, his heart exploding with relief. "I am here," he said, his forehead pressed against her hand. "I am right here." For the first time in his life, Peter Blackwood felt fragile, stripped of armor, clinging to the only truth that mattered. He had almost lost her, and he would never, ever let that happen again. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. For 2 days, Peter barely moved from the chair at Arya's bedside, his suit crumpled, his hair disheveled, his gray eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. His empire could have crumbled around him, and he would not have noticed. He had lived through meetings with ruthless investors, had faced hostile takeovers without blinking, but nothing had ever reduced him to this, the sight of Arya lying pale beneath white sheets, her breath measured by the rise and fall of machines. When she finally stirred awake, whispering his name with lips barely moving, Peter broke. He grasped her hand, his head bowing against her skin as relief crashed over him like a tide. "I am here," he murmured. "I will never let you go again." Arya blinked, her voice fragile but laced with stubbornness. "You should not worry so much. We are not." "Do not finish that sentence." He cut her off, his tone hoarse, trembling. "No more pretending, Arya. No more lies, no more roles. I was a fool not to believe you." Tears welled in her eyes, slipping across her cheeks. "There were times I used you to reach closer to the truth. But somewhere along the way, my heart betrayed my reason. I fell in love with you, Peter." He lifted his gaze, his eyes blazing with raw regret and something stronger. "So did I. From the night you stumbled in those cursed heels, I knew my heart was no longer mine. But I was too proud, too afraid, to admit it." A frail laugh broke from her lips. "You're making jokes about shoes." "Yes," he said softly, "because you taught me how." He leaned closer, pressing his forehead against hers. His voice was low, desperate but steady. "No more pretending. I want the world to know you are mine." Days blurred together as she regained strength. Peter never left her side. He worked from her hospital room, reading reports with one hand while holding hers with the other. Emily visited often, teasing her brother mercilessly. "My brother is peeling apples for you," she said with a grin. "Father would faint." Arya laughed softly as Peter struggled with the knife, his cheeks faintly pink. "I have never done this for anyone before," he whispered to her later. "You should feel special." "I do," she said, her eyes shining. When she was finally strong enough to leave the hospital, Peter called a press conference. The room was packed, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. For years, he had been the image of cold authority, his mask unbreakable. But that day, his voice rang with conviction and warmth. "I, Peter Blackwood, stand before you to declare the truth. I am innocent of the accusations. The true culprit has been brought to justice. And there is one person I must thank, the woman who risked everything to reveal it." He turned to Arya, who stood uncertain at the edge of the stage, her heart hammering. He extended his hand. She hesitated only a second before placing hers in his. He drew her into the light, ignoring the gasps and flashes. Reporters clamored, "Who is she? Is she your fiancé? What role did she play?" But Peter looked only at her. "Just for her, no more pretending," he whispered. Arya's eyes filled, her smile trembling. "No more pretending," she echoed. That evening, he took her back to the riverside,
where they had once walked as strangers caught in pretense. But this time, the silence was tender, not heavy. He pulled from his pocket a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple, glimmering ring. I cannot promise perfection. I have learned it does not exist. But I can promise to stand with you, to believe in you, to fight beside you. Will you give me a new beginning? Arya's laugh burst through her tears. You really know how to pick a moment. I am still wearing a hospital coat. All the better, he said with a crooked smile. It proves I am serious. Her yes was soft but radiant. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. This time, he whispered, it is forever. Autumn settled over the city, gold and crisp, the kind of season that carried both endings and beginnings. At the Blackwood estate, roses bloomed in the garden, rows of white chairs lined neatly beneath satin ribbons. This was no gala with hundreds of guests. Only Emily, a handful of loyal friends, and the staff who had stood by him through years of storms. Behind the glass doors, Arya stood in a simple white gown, her hands trembling around a bouquet. Emily grinned beside her. Relax, she whispered. My brother is out there looking like he might cry. He is more nervous than you. Arya laughed, the sound easing her chest. The music began. The doors opened. She walked slowly down the flower-strewn aisle. Every gaze turned toward her, but she saw only one. Peter, waiting at the altar, his black suit flawless, his gray eyes brimming with emotion. When she reached him, the minister's voice carried over the hush. We gather here to witness not a performance, not a pretense, but love made real. Peter clasped her hands, his voice unsteady yet strong. I once believed I had to be perfect, cold, unfeeling, to protect everything I built. But when I met you, I learned all I needed was to be myself. I promised to never let you fight alone again. I promised to believe you even if the whole world turns away. Tears spilled down her cheeks, her smile radiant. I came to you pretending, but my heart betrayed me. I fell in love with you. I promise to stand beside you in light and in darkness. And I promise not to let treacherous heels trip me again, so you will not have to catch me. Laughter rippled through the small crowd, breaking the solemnity. Even Peter chuckled, his grip tightening on her hands. The minister smiled. You may kiss the bride. Peter leaned in, his lips brushing hers, as applause and cheers rose around them. Emily's laughter rang above it all. Later that night, they sat by the garden pond with only close friends around, warm yellow lights reflecting off the water. Arya leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. It is funny, she whispered. We began with a single whisper of pretend, and now here we are. Peter kissed her hair, his voice low, steady. No more pretending. This is forever. The fireworks bloomed above them, their reflections glimmering in their eyes. And for the first time since their paths had collided, the storm was gone. What remained was not pretense, not scandal, not fear. Only truth, and a love fierce enough to last. The morning after the wedding dawned with a quiet clarity. The city stretched awake beneath a sky painted in gold, and for the first time in months, Arya did not feel the weight of secrets pressing against her chest. She lay in bed, sunlight streaming through the curtains, her hand resting in Peter's. The ring on her finger glimmered softly, not just a band of metal, but a promise forged in fire and storm. Peter stirred beside her, his breath warm against her hair. He had always risen early, conditioned by years of relentless ambition, but today he lingered. He shifted only to pull her closer, murmuring with a voice still heavy from sleep. This feels unreal. Arya smiled, her eyes closed. We spent so long pretending. I half expect to wake and find it was all just another act. No more acts, he said firmly, his hand tightening around hers. Later, they walked through the Blackwood gardens where the roses were heavy with dew. Emily met them there, her laughter light as she teased her brother about the uncharacteristic softness in his gaze. Arya laughed too, and Peter endured it with a patience that surprised them all. Emily leaned in to whisper to Arya, "Thank you. He is not the same man he was before you. He finally breathes." The days that followed carried the rhythm of rebuilding. Richard Hale's arrest dominated the headlines, and Arya's article became the centerpiece of every conversation about journalistic courage. Critics praised her precision, though many whispered about her personal ties to Peter. She did not shy from the scrutiny. She stood in front of cameras, shoulders straight, voice steady, declaring that the pursuit of truth had been her only guide. Peter faced his own storm. The board demanded explanations, shareholders pressed for assurance, and the markets swayed with uncertainty. But this time he did not stand alone. Arya sat beside him in meetings, her presence quiet yet unshakable. She spoke little, but her silence carried strength, a reminder to him and to all that his world no longer rested solely on his shoulders. At night, when the city lights glowed outside their windows, they allowed themselves moments of vulnerability. She confessed the guilt she still carried, how she had once approached him with deception. He confessed his fear, how easily pride had blinded him, how close he had come to losing her forever. Each admission was a thread mended, weaving a fabric stronger than before. One evening, he returned from the office later than expected, tension etched into his brow. Arya met him at the door, her hand brushing his cheek. "Hard day." He nodded, his voice low. "Harder than most. They still doubt me. Some will never believe I was innocent." She tilted her head, her eyes steady. "Then we show them, not with words, but with what you build next." His gaze softened, pride flickering in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. "You always see the path forward, even when I cannot." Weeks turned into months. The scandal slowly faded into memory as new headlines took its place. The Wynn Consortium announced investments in clean energy, scholarships for underprivileged students, and a foundation in his mother's name. For the first time, Peter did not pursue expansion merely for power. He pursued it for legacy, for value beyond profit. Arya returned to the newsroom, her colleagues greeting her with a mixture of awe and envy. She worked as fiercely as ever, but her articles carried a new depth, a sharpness honed by experience and tempered by empathy. She no longer wrote only to expose, she wrote to illuminate. At night, she and Peter shared their worlds, his filled with strategies and negotiations, hers with words and revelations. Sometimes they argued, sharp and stubborn, but always they returned to each other, unwilling to let pride carve another rift between them. One evening, as autumn returned with its crisp air, Peter led her back to the riverbank where so much had unfolded. The water shimmered under the city lights, the same as the night he had first confessed that she made him forget the pretense. He held her hand tightly, his eyes unguarded. "Do you ever think about how it began?" he asked. "Every day," she admitted with a laugh. "One whisper at a wedding. Pretend you are with me. And now," he said, his voice firm, "I cannot imagine a life without you." She leaned against him, her heart full. "Neither could I." They stood there, watching the water flow, the city moving endlessly around them. For the first time, there was no shadow of scandal, no fear of betrayal, no mask of pretense. Only truth, hard-won and fiercely guarded. The world would continue to whisper, to judge, to pry. But they had weathered storms stronger than gossip, survived dangers sharper than rumor. Arya looked up at him, her voice soft but certain. "Whatever comes, we face it together." He bent, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Together." And with that single word, spoken against the backdrop of a city alive with light, their story began again, not as a performance, not as a lie, but as a life woven from truth, from scars, from love unshaken by fire. A new dawn stretched above them, and they walked into it side by side.